Joseph Biehl, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you, Dan.
Welcome to everyone in the Sophia audience, meaningoflife.tv, bloggingheads.tv. Sophia program is available on streaming video and audio podcast. I'm here with Joseph Biehl, who I know very well and going back quite a long time, but I'm going to ask him first to introduce himself and just list some of the things that he's doing and about which is the most of our conversation today is going to be about. So, Joe, why don't you go ahead?
All right, Dan, thank you. I am a philosopher here in New York City. I graduated from CUNY, the Graduate Center. I got my PhD there in philosophy. After teaching for a number of years, I left academia in a formal capacity, and I started a nonprofit called the Gotham Philosophical Society. The idea to bring philosophy outside of the academy, make it a part of the very fabric of the city to what extent we can. We've put on events where we kind of public events for a general audience. We have started a magazine. We just started it this year. We hope to see it grow. It's called Phi on New York. The idea is to have some of the philosophers who live and work here in the city create a conversation to think about what life in the city is like from a philosophical perspective, almost any aspect of city life. And we have a youth program called Young Philosophers of New York. The idea is to generate interest and provide access to philosophy, to encourage philosophical reasoning from K through 12. We've done some after school programs. We're trying to get into the public schools now. It looks like we're going to be starting that in January. Got a public school here in Washington Heights that we hope to be in. Just any way that we can kind of make New York a more thoughtful and philosophical city. That's part of our mission.
And you have a book that just came out recently. Am I correct? On this subject of philosophy in the city?
Yes, the Rutledge Handbook of Philosophy of the City, which I, of course, have right here. This just came out at the end of the summer. It is co-edited by Sharon Marr, Samantha Knoll, and myself. Some of your viewers might know Samantha Knoll. She works at the University of Washington. She does a lot of work on food and sustainability. Sharon Marr has worked extensively in philosophy of the city, and she was one of the original founders of the Public Philosophy Network. So some will know her through that vein as well.
And you have you also contributed an essay, am I correct?
Yes, I did. It's called Back to the Cave, which is the idea of when the philosopher in the allegory of the cave goes out to the brilliant light of truth, the sunlit uplands. The idea is that he's responsible. He has an obligation to come back into the cave. So that's part of what I'm talking.
The city's
the cave. Yeah.
And you're the philosopher who's returned.
Well, I think that
returned.
Well, I'm not the only one. But I try to make a case for how to think about that return.
Sure. And for full disclosure purposes, let me say that Joe and I've known Joe since 1991. We have a lot of connections. One thing, we actually grew up very close to each other on Long Island. I grew up in Roslyn. He grew up in Williston Park, which is probably a 5 minutes drive away, but didn't know each other growing up. Met in graduate school around 1991. Eventually we became roommates, housemates, both in Manhattan and Queens. So I know Joe very, very well and for a long time. Joe, let's first thing I just would like to know, excuse me. So when we were coming out of graduate school, there was a very standard traditional ambition, and that was, you tried to get a tenure track job or some sort of full-time job in philosophy in an academic department. I did this. You did this. You then, however, chose to leave and to go into a purely public intellectual capacity. Now, I myself am doing something similar. I haven't left formally. I still am employed by the university. Excuse me, but a lot more of my work, much larger share of my work now is what I would call in the area of public intellectualism. So I'd like to hear a little bit just about your journey. Why did you, because you left academia much earlier, and why did you do that, and why did you decide to go this route?
Yes, I left in 2014, and then I started Gotham Philosophical Society, almost immediately thereafter. I think there are kind of a number of strands to it, kind of just in some ways feeling a bit burnt out by the academic environment or no longer feeling entirely comfortable in it. I always had, kind of from a productive standpoint, writing articles for journals never came easy for me. In many ways, there was something kind of tedious for me about kind of writing them and publishing them in conferences. I wanted to, I guess I wanted to think about things in a way that kind of had a much more broader impact. Broader in a certain sense, kind of like just non-academic, so just not having other academics as the interlocutors, but also a little bit more focused on life here in New York, and an element of that, and we can come back. I know we want to talk about philosophy of a particular city, so like philosophy of New York, but some of it is philosophical. I am not kind of a universalist about truth, about normativity, about any of these things. I think that many of these issues are localized, parochial. I talk about philosophy as being kind of in many ways a parochial activity, though I know many philosophers would disagree with that, as I have tried to recruit philosophers to think about life here in the city and think about, try to apply some of their ideas. I have been told by some philosophers, well, my philosophy isn't parochial. So they don't have kind of these limited applications. Yeah. But I actually think that philosophy ideally can do that. And so it was, some of the constraints of academia, some of the politics of academia, and trying to write things and engage other philosophers. I found it a very somewhat limiting, the restrictions, publishing things that no one reads. Those sorts of things contributed to a kind of a growing dissatisfaction that, though I very much still have this passion and love for philosophy and want to pursue it, doing it within the confines of the college classroom, I was personally finding less and less satisfying. Yeah.
The academic publishing, I'm totally with you on. It's gotten very frustrating. You realize, how few people you're talking to. You realize how esoteric most of what you're talking about is. You being and you especially, the area you've always been mostly interested in is ethics, in which you get the least mileage out of the purely academic discussion, in which the whole point of the whole endeavor ultimately is to be applied, right? I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's not a subject that has a purely theoretical interest. At least I've never seen it that way. I work in a lot of more abstract areas. I mean, I do work in metaphysics and epistemology, and so I didn't quite feel as I didn't grow as dissatisfied with academic publishing as quickly as you, because I was interested in things that really there are only a few other people who are interested in that want to talk to you about them.
You were probably also more successful at it.
I was quite successful at it. I didn't have trouble getting published. I do write very quickly. As you, I'm sure you remember, I'm one thing I don't have a problem with is speed and verbosity and all of that sort of thing. But I did also get a little tired of what struck me as more and more kind of almost an unstated requirement to conform to a whole bunch of orthodoxies that are currently pervasive in the discipline. And I'm not just talking about political ones. I'm talking about orthodoxies even within the technical areas that I just was really more and more just didn't want to be constrained by. Also, the writing style. I more and more came to care about the actual writing, the literary quality of what I was doing, because I'm becoming what I think is quite a good writer. And the way you have to write for these academic journals is just shit. Excuse my French, but I mean it's not good writing for the most part. So I hear you on that. The teaching, I'm a little less, because one of the things you are doing is this youth program, which we'll talk about, I hope, in a little more detail. So I'm not sure I understand what put you off the teaching side of it. I understand the academic publishing, but the teaching side of it, those are real people, right? In the sense that they're and they're young. So what about the teaching side of it? Did you get demoralized by, demystified with?
I think it was the apathy of the students, the general apathy of the students. Sorry to say, wore me down. So instead of, kind of becoming to know myself, I thought of myself as a fairly, good teacher, full of all sorts of passion and thrilled to engage students when I first started teaching, and as you know, taught for quite some time as an adjunct while I was in graduate school. But over time, the apathy of my students was growing, and I was not responding, as like Robin Williams and standing on the desk and firing them up. Their apathy was affecting me and changing me. So I was becoming more apathetic about how I was teaching. And I don't think that's very good. I became a worse teacher, and that it was important to me to not do that. I mean, to some, they deserve better than what I was increasingly doing. I also, though, again, what was another way of my thinking about this was that this apathy needed to be addressed earlier. That the need to get to the kids earlier than college.
College is too late.
College is often too late. I don't want to. You don't want to write anybody off. And if they had the Robin Williams, if they had if they had the right teacher, then maybe it can happen. But I do think that there are many students by the time of college, they do not want to really engage philosophically. Again, there are some, and it also depends on what kind of institution you are. If you are at maybe some top-notch institution, maybe you're going to get more. But for where I was, you're having people who, a lot of them, they want to get through. They want to get a job. They want to just, they don't want to be challenged in many ways in the classroom. And I think that is unfortunate on a number of levels. And because of the Young Philosophers program, I think of kids, particularly at a younger age, they are much more intuitively philosophical. They have philosophical questions. They're capable of thinking abstractly, thinking normatively, running
Certainly,
through all sorts of different ideas.
Certainly adolescence. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there is, for too many of those students, there's not that much philosophy or opportunities for those adolescents to philosophize. There are some, and we can talk more about that, but for many of them, they are in an educational environment where there is insufficient time, or it's conceived that there's insufficient time for them to philosophize. They've got the curriculum that they have to meet. There are things that they are required to do. And so their philosophical questions go unanswered. And the more they go unanswered, the less they get asked. So by the time they get to college, many of them have just ceased asking those questions at all. And so when you go into the classroom, and like many philosophers, can kind of try to be a bit Socratic and try to get things out of them and, say, what do you think? They stare back at you. And it's like, don't ask me what I think, tell me what I need to know. So in order to change that, to try to find a cure, in a sense, for that apathy, one, we need to do other things like change the business model we have of education. But I think kids need to be philosophically, you need to reach them. They need to be engaged at a much younger age. And so I think it's important, in a sense, to do pre-college philosophy. And it's a bit of know thyself. I was getting to the point where I really shouldn't have been in front of a college classroom. I mean, maybe I could do it now. But at the time, I was getting burnt out.
When did you leave?
2014.
Okay, so far. The reason it's just listening to you, it's kind of eerie because I'm thinking so many of the same things myself. I'm just coming to it a little later. That's all. But I'm starting to feel that part of the reason that I'm planning on retiring. So once Victoria graduates high school, both Nancy and my wife and I are considering retiring. And that is that I don't think that I'm the right person to be teaching these people anymore. And for me, I'm starting to, and I'm ashamed to say this, I'm actually starting to feel active contempt for my students. And that's just, you cannot be someone's teacher. I mean, that's a fundamental violation of the mission, right? I mean, yeah. And that tells me that I'm either too old, not too old in any absolute sense, but too far away from them psychologically. And I think that you're partly right in terms of the age issue. You need to get to them sooner. But I think even irrespective of the age issue, we need to talk to people outside of these formal frameworks, the purposes of which have become completely corrupted in their minds, right? As well as in reality. And so here's what I'm getting at. They really do only view their higher education as a process of certification at this point, professional certification. They don't view it anymore in the way that we viewed it when we were in school. Sure, certainly we viewed it partly that way, but we also viewed it as sort of the time when we would fully come into ourselves, right, as adults, as people, find our intellectual place where we, what we think about things, all that sort of thing. I just don't see that now. And actually, it's not better with the higher level students. It's worse. That's why I refuse anymore to teach in the honors college, because their certification fixation is 15 times more intense and more mercenary than that of the lower levels. So I would rather actually teach the delinquents at this point. Because, no, there's still some chance, since they're not so concerned about getting along in the system, there's still more of a chance that they might actually be interested. Excuse me. So I'm feeling a lot of the same things you're feeling, and wanting more and more to just engage with people outside of these formal environments that I don't really think are serving the purpose that they used to serve. I don't know if it sounds to me like we're very similar on this in terms of what we're dissatisfied about. So let's actually then talk about what you are doing. So I guess Gotham is the umbrella, right? And then everything else you're doing is a manifestation of it, or falls under it, or.
Yeah, I think that's, you could say that. So Gotham Philosophical Society is the nonprofit. That's the organization. It's the kind of an online platform is Phi on New York, and the Youth Education Young Philosophers of New York.
So let's just be now much more specific. What is the actual mission of Gotham? What is it? What is it your stated purpose to do? And what are some of the ways you've been trying to do it?
Well, to bring critical thinking, analytical imagination to the thought of everyday life in the city. So from providing people with opportunities to think about aspects of their lives here in the city from a deeper philosophical perspective, doing that, say, through events, having philosophers write some things focusing on various aspects of the city, whether it's the transportation system, whether it is environmental policy, whether it's about architecture in the city, about the building boom. It can be overtly political. It can be light, thinking of kind of artistic, reviews of films or performances. Would like to influence policy, to have philosophers provide a view of issues and challenges and questions facing the city. The city continues to evolve, and it always will. Primarily, it is concern for profit that determines basically what policies we have. And I would like philosophers, and not just philosophers, but philosophers to contribute to this. But I would like people who are in positions of making decisions, policymakers, politicians, community activists, to be exposed to different ways of thinking about some of these issues, coming at it from a different angle, having philosophers kind of be a part of that kind of conversation about the direction of the city.
So this is mostly, though, going to engage it's in some way with the political landscape of the city, right? Because even if you're all these issues you listed, whether it's transportation or the real estate boom or what have you, ultimately the aim is, or the idea is, that to try to affect legislation and administration, right? Of all these things, So, there may be a philosophical issue regarding, I don't know, let's say the city's parks, right? Having to do with aesthetics, historical preservation, whatever. But ultimately, the point is to hope to bring some of this analysis and maybe more thoughtful approaches to these subjects to the ears of policy makers and administrators, correct? Yes,
that's a goal. Yes.
So you host events, and I assume events are sort of speaking engagements.
Yes. We've had kind of different kinds of events. We've had speaking engagements where it's the kind of more your traditional speaker presenting a topic, meant to not to be full of technical jargon, but meant for a general audience, a philosophical issue of various kinds. We've done other community events where we had a series called "A Lawyer, a Poet, and a Philosopher Walk into a Bar." And the idea was to have a theme, a topic. So we talked about truth once. We talked about love. We talked about money. We talked about misery. We talked about innocence. And the idea was that the lawyer would address the topic from kind of a legal perspective. How does the legal system kind of think about or engage with this concept? The poet took it from an artistic perspective, and the philosopher from a philosophical perspective. And then the audience becomes a part of this conversation. And what's interesting, lawyer, poet, and philosopher walk into a bar. Those the ultimate conversations were almost 95% philosophical.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just immediately, people wanted to get, once you give them the opportunity to start really kind of chewing on something and thinking about something, that's where they want to go.
Yeah.
But it was wonderful in a sense to have the lawyer, the legal and the artistic kind of feeding it and giving you some things to, kind of points to work around. So that's a sort of an event. We've had some panel discussions on the nature of pregnancy and the experiences of people having miscarriage and kind of the philosophical dimensions of that. That was a very successful event. So they aren't always explicitly political, like, okay, let's have an event so that we can kind of create some new policy action. But some of the events, and certainly one of the goals of the magazine would be to kind of steer the conversation in a way that potentially, when there are issues of this sort of relevance, that it could get in front of the eyes of policymakers and politicians, and they might think about these issues in a new way.
So it's not the association. The association. It's not your intent to ever sort of be involved in sort of direct lobbying, right? Of city government, or it's more a precursor to that. You hope to sort of engage in the kind of thinking and conversations that then might lead other people to lobby.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair point. Certainly at this point, that's how we conceive the mission. Would be that it would be the precursor. Let's get the conversation going so that we could inspire some community activists to say, okay, that was a really interesting thing I read or I heard or I part of this conversation, and then start moving in that direction.
Yeah. How much of this thing is going on? I mean, the so-called philosophical cafes have been going on for a while. I know Massimo, who's a regular partner of mine here, who I'm sure you know, and I think he's done events for you.
Yes.
Massimo has been running philosophical cafes for quite a long time. Aside from the sort of the philosophical cafe phenomenon, I mean, how much of this stuff is going on in New York?
Well, there's Massimo doing the cafe. Ian Olasov, who is a grad student at City University of New York, he runs an organization called Brooklyn Public Philosophers, and they have public talks at the Brooklyn Public Library. So he's got some nice digs there, and so those are talks for general audience. And he also has a great thing he started called Ask a Philosopher booth. So he has set up, and I've done some of these with him, but it's exactly what it sounds like. So going to a Green Market, going to Union Square, Bryant Park, he will, he has it's a table, with chairs and a banner. It says, Ask a Philosopher. And he'll put out a couple of bowls that have, maybe some thought experiments or some philosophical questions, and a bowl of candy. If you have a question or something you'd like to talk about, you can raise it. If you don't have a question of your own, And you're like, okay, well, let me see what this is all about. You can put your hand into the bowl and pull out, the Chinese room experiment or something like that.
Right.
And you can sit down and have a conversation. As I said, I've done a few of them with him. He's done, many of them, and often it's like a 4-hour session, and he has a number of different philosophers come sit down for 2 hours. The time flies. It's you're sitting in Bryant Park and you're just like talking to people. People walk by, they like look at the sign, and they're like, all right, just wonderful little piece of it's public engagement, it's public philosophy, it's public theater. It's you get very, very interesting questions. Why is there anti-Semitism? And questions that you can feel, okay, I could try to answer this, and questions where like you sit and
so I have no idea.
I do not know, and you try to work it out. But they're wonderful experiences. So there's that. I think if I could say something, what Gotham Philosophical Society, or what my goal has been with it, that I think is somewhat distinguishes itself from Brooklyn Public Philosophers and what Massimo's doing with Philosophy Cafe, I guess, is this self-consciously kind of political dimension to it. I am interested not just in the wonder of philosophy and sharing that and having people think about okay, let's have a talk that you might give to colleagues. Well, why don't you do it in a way for an audience because it's something that they rarely get and it's kind of intrinsically valuable. That's wonderful. I do think it's important, and this is kind of the back to the cave thing of, what can we kind of do about the lives we're living, the city that we live in. We live here. How can we make this city a better place? Can we make our lives a better place? And using philosophy to look at how to answer those questions, to provide some answers, to make the questions and the thought about it more substantive, to be more engaged. Again, on every facet. They're your big ticket items, but even the lesser ones. About what we can do with the green space. What should we be doing about specialized high schools in New York City? You name it. The way that their lives are affected here, I think it's important to see what philosophy can help move that discussion along. So that is overtly significant to me, and the mission of Gotham Philosophical Society.
So let me just ask you a few more things in this direction. So I guess one thing I would I'm trying to think what order I want to ask these in. I guess I wonder, the space between just sort of generally like making people more aware of philosophy, right? And bringing it more into the public discourse rather than having it be cloistered in the academy. Between that and the very specific application of philosophical techniques, tool sets, etc., to specific issues that have philosophical weight in your city, right? I guess with regard to the latter, and maybe this is a bit of a challenge, could you say that for a place like New York City, it's actually a little bit late for that? And here's what I'm getting at. And you tell me, what you think of this. It felt to me, so you and I both lived in Manhattan when we were in graduate school. We lived there the entire 1990s. And it felt to me like during that decade, the city kind of made a collective decision of what it was going to be in perpetuity, right? Like, so we came out of the 60s and the 70s. We came out of the 70s when the city was really sort of a really dangerous, crime-ridden, falling apart kind of place. This is sort of, I get the image from like Taxi Driver, right? That was the city of the 70s. It wasn't that there was no like wealthy pockets in the city, but they were kind of surrounded by, into the 80s, when you still had this really bad crime wave, you also had a lot of racial unrest and conflict. And then the 90s came, and during the period while you and I were living there together, it felt to me like the city made a collective decision. It was going to go clean. It was going to go corporate. It was going to go mega rich. And that's exactly what it did. To the point to which, I can remember when you'd be scared to walk down 42nd Street in the middle of the daytime, because it was nothing but, porno theaters and crackheads and hookers. And now it's like Disney World. You could walk down 42nd Street at 3:00 in the morning waving $100 bills and nothing would happen to you. I feel like the city kind of made this very strong collective decision. It was going to go in this direction. It was going to become this corporate, safe, super clean, super wealthy place. And now that it's on that course, that just simply entails a number of things, right, that are just going to be the case. And I guess I don't know what you could possibly do about that other than to fight at the biggest level that decision. But once that decision has kind of been embraced, it seems like everything else sort of follows from it, right? So what is there really – I guess I'm wondering if it's a little too late to try to get the city to be thoughtful. It already went through its process of thinking what it was going to become, and it's done it, right?
Well,
it's a provocation. I'm not saying go home. I'm asking you, how much efficacy do you think you can have in such a hyper billionaire-ish corporatized environment? They just don't give a crap, right? And they're not going to allow anything to happen that would affect that larger direction, right? And I don't even know that they could be democratically opposed at this point, right? Since they control all of the candidates and they control all of the, right? I mean, what could you possibly do at this point? There's too much money, isn't there?
There may well be. I think, while I'm sympathetic to a certain degree your point about the 90s, certainly that was a transformative decade. I mean, look, the money's always been there. I mean, it's always been kind of run by moneyed interests, as I've put it in places. I mean, New York is run by the moneymakers, using the Platonic terminology. Absolutely. Whether anything can be done, New York City is not going to become, some sort of, social experiment, some sort of commune anytime soon. But I do think that, whether it's working on the margins, or it's taking issue by issue, trying to kind of move the needle in a way towards a more equitable, somewhat more just city. I mean, the fact, it is a kind of the things that you said are true. The city's got a corporate sheen on it that it did not have 30 years ago.
It's why I really don't enjoy going there anymore. I mean, I go there sometimes, I visit my parents who still live on Long Island. I'll go into the city. But I really just don't really like the place anymore. It seemed to have really just become a corporate billionaire's paradise that just sort of doesn't really have any edge or
Well, it's the vanishing New York syndrome. So there's a book recently put out kind of documenting all of these kind of iconic parts of the city that are disappearing. Look, that is troubling. There's something, there's kind of aesthetic issues there. There's ethical issues. But there are grave injustices here in the city. There's great inequality. Life can be very, very difficult for people here in the city, all sorts of different people. Our education system is rife with problems. While there is enormous amounts of money here, how that money is used, how it is distributed in terms of the various services, all of these are they're standing challenges, standing questions that need to be addressed. And they may ultimately be addressed, as they are often addressed, in terms of, what will make the most powerful people as much profit as possible. But I think I don't want to be so cynical to say that it's pointless.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that.
I want us to think about what we can do. And you can't get anything done unless you try. Maybe we can make the education system much more thoughtful and much more equitable. Maybe we can put more money into the transportation system and make it much more accessible for people who have various physical disabilities, for mothers and fathers. I pushed my kids around the city in strollers. 25% of the subway stations in the city, only about 25% of them have elevators.
Right.
It's not a very accessible system. And that's just,
So there's something very specific, right? So that's good, because what I was just about to ask you was, could you say one or two things that you think there actually is still some space to sort of make changes that would be informed by sort of a philosophical critique and then a discussion? So let's take the issue of access, right? The New York City subways are always notoriously bad in terms of access, partly because the system's so damn old, right? I mean, everything was built before we had all these federal regulations and imperatives regarding accessibility for disabled people and stuff. So let's take that as a specific issue. Is your idea sort of that, hey, look, perhaps if the people involved were thinking of this more straightforwardly as a flat-out ethical issue, there would be more. There might be more urgency and action in that regard. Is that sort of the sense in which you want to try to contribute to a conversation that you could see having direct efficacy? Is that the sort of thing you're thinking about?
Yes, to some degree, yes. That drawing attention to the ethical dimensions of this. It's not merely a matter of efficiency of, say, moving people around the city. But there is, an ethical. There is an ethical dimension to this. There's a piece in Phi on New York by the philosopher Jennifer Scurrow. She wrote a piece on access, where she's trying to draw attention to just this sort of thing, to make a case that. We've got there are moral dimensions, ethical dimensions to things like transportation. And, we can even, you can make cases that even with respect to efficiency, having it more accessible to more people will have, pay dividends in terms of productivity and what have you. So that is a big part of it. Having us think about it not in just such a kind of a narrow way. It's just it's a mode of transportation.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm assuming, when that there was an ethical conversation, let's just call it that went on, that was part of the engine that fueled the creation of these various disability regulations and laws that we have. The federal, the Anti-Discrimination Act, probably based on a philosophical conversation. But then once it's sort of in place, the conversation turns into a conversation about compliance, about legal compliance, right? I'm assuming that New York has somehow figured out some way to get around these compliance issues, because I have to assume that a lot of New York subway access is actually in just flat out violation, right, of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I guess what I'm asking you as a philosopher is part of the point also to not allow these issues to just simply become matters of compliance with regulations that then allow people to find the loopholes, and the point is to keep saying, no, this is a profoundly moral question, right?
Yeah, no,
the fact that you're complying,
yes,
doesn't change the fact that 60% of the damn handicapped people cannot get into the fucking subway, right? Is sort of the idea?
Yes, that is certainly a part of it. That it is not just about compliance with regulations. Of course, a dimension of this should also be looking at the regulations. Are the regulations, what are they? Are they sufficient? Sufficient to what? Are they just? Right. Could they be improved? Basically, so I mean, I'm a, kind of like a full, philosophy can look at anything. Look at anything we do, take a step back and try to critique it. Critique it in the sense of, what have we been doing here? To what purpose? To what end? Is it sufficient to that end? Is the end a legitimate end? Is there a way that we can improve upon this? Is there a way that we can supersede this practice that we've been doing? So we can talk about the subway system. We can talk about any sort of regulations, basically anything that we can use the philosophical skills of kind of real critical analytical reflection on these things to have us rethink just what it is we're doing. Yeah. Rather than just continuing, of course, we got to comply with these things. These are the regulations. We should be looking at the regulations as well. And of course, if we're satisfied with them, we're satisfied with them.
Yeah.
But should we be hiring more police officers to patrol the city? Is that a good use of the funds that the governor, is? And what are the police officers doing? Is it? Do we have security issues? Fare evasion, is that really the problem that we have? I think, again, philosophers can contribute to this conversation about how we are, what is, how is the city thinking about its transportation issues and challenges?
Yeah. I'm just curious as an aside. I mean, how is New York not in constant violation of federal?
I don't know the answer. When we're done here, I'm going to actually look into that because, as the statistic I gave you before,
it's kind of a shocking number. I mean,
it's overwhelming. It's about 75% of the system. You don't have elevator access.
Right, this would seem to be flat out violation, and I'm assuming that the city's lawyers have figured out a way to be technically in compliance without, But this reminds me also, it's actually a conversation we just had in one of our department meetings. It seems to me like in a kind of preemptive defense against philosophers trying to get involved in these conversations. You almost have this sort of lower level, less philosophical, but it can kind of pose at it, sort of professional standards regimen that sort of comes in. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So we are no longer able to offer a business ethics course because in order for the course to run, business students would have to take it. Right? The problem is that the business school doesn't want them taking our business ethics course because some of the things they're going to learn in the business ethics course are basically going to out much of what's being taught in the business school as just flat out unethical, right? So what the business school has done is they've created a course in business ethics, but really all it is it's a kind of a professional standards course. Now, that's all fine and well, but if the profession is corrupted, and then so are its standards, right? And so it doesn't do you any good. In other words, the professional standards is there largely to sort of make excuses and offer post hoc rationalizations. And I wonder whether what you're describing is this in a more generalized form, and that is in the sense that philosophers are going to have to really push themselves into this conversations because there's almost a kind of a built-in resistance. It's like if we let those people in, then we're going to have to discuss all these things, and we really would rather not, right? Because the interests involved aren't going to benefit from them.
Well, look, I mean, if you're going to take the idea of the gadfly seriously, you do kind of have to take up kind of, I think, have to be, annoying in some respects, and to push. I speaking for myself, I think, and others can decide, how much this is true of them. How much we just simply accept and just take for granted, that this is standard operating procedure, and just you kind of tinkering away, kind of without really kind of pushing in and saying, wait a minute, let's how much if we can rethink here at the margin, maybe we can keep pushing in and just start eventually kind of rethinking it all. So I do think that philosophers, I would like to see philosophers do more. I would like to do more of it, and I'm kind of feeling my way on how to do that. How to really be kind of a part of my community. As I've said, philosophers. I've written this, in that the essay. Philosophers, they live and they work in their communities, but much of what they do has no real bearing on their communities. So they're not philosophizing for their communities or philosophizing with their communities. And if we think of philosophy, if we think that that philosophy is important and there are certain skills. I know you had a conversation with Massimo about expertise, philosophical expertise. I'm in the camp that I think much more sympathetic with you. I mean, I think that philosophers have certain skills that have been honed in part by their education, by their kind of the philosophical training as you keep going. These are not skills that you can only get through philosophy. And there are non-philosophers who have these skills to degrees far in excess of many philosophers. But philosophy is a wonderful way to get these skills and to develop them. And I think applying those skills, applying that kind of critical engagement to kind of the real life you're leading, in community with others, I think is important. So, I mean, I think it's kind of part of the Socratic mission. I think that I would like to see the philosophical community of New York City, which is highly regarded. It's significant in number. It's significant in talent. But in many ways, it's kind of invisible.
Yeah, I mean,
in the life
NYU, between NYU, City University of New York, Columbia, and then, of course, in the orbit, Rutgers. You're talking about some of the top programs in the country. You're talking about, in the case of NYU, huge programs with dozens of people working in them. And you're absolutely right. They may as well not be there at all, if what you mean is their impact on the actual city itself, right? I mean, they might as well none of them be there, and it is awfully odd, right? In a certain way. But I also think that actually the elite quality of these institutions is part of the reason, right? It works against you. I almost think you'd be better off trying to recruit from the community colleges and from the people who are not so invested in the institution and who have a lot more tangible contact with the more ordinary people in the city. You know what I mean? I almost think you'd be better off trying to recruit from the 2-year institutions.
We recruit from anywhere.
We'll take whatever we can get.
It's.
Let me ask you, because you said something really interesting off camera that I wanted to ask you about, and it's apropos given what you were just talking about, and maybe this will be the thing we'll close on. You said to me that, in your view, philosophy ultimately is parochial rather than universalist, and that really interests me. I suspect I very much agree with you, but I would like you to talk about that more in the context of why a philosophy of a particular city, right? I understand even the idea of philosophy of urban life as opposed to, let's say, rural or suburban or whatever. I could see, but why such a particular idea of a philosophy of a particular place? And maybe you could discuss this issue of parochial versus universalist in that context.
Yeah. Well, in line with what some of the other things I was just saying before, it's like, New York's where I live. So I'm interested, as you mentioned before, I mean, my originally it was, ethics, meta-ethics, normativity, which took me into thinking about truth. I am, when you say kind of a non-universalist, like I'm an irrealist about these things, kind of use technical philosophical terms. There are no objective, normative truths as far as I am concerned. So these are things, it's a human product. We create them, and we create them kind of, I think, in relationships, in engagements with one another. And this particular city is a particular, and its particular communities. People are here. We're working our way around the issues that arise and the challenges that we face. We're creating our norms. We're creating our sense of expectations of one another. We're creating the normative path about what we ought and ought not do, what our goals are. And it's not the same as Springfield, Missouri, and it's not the same as Los Angeles, and it's not the same as Cambridge, Massachusetts, or where have you. It is parochial, that the philosophical skills of trying to think through how to live. Well, you live here and you live now in this place with these people. So in that sense, the question of how to live, that Socratic kind of question, I mean, or, what ought I to do? It's what ought I to do here with you, right? And how can we, where are we going to go? How are we going to get there? I think those are kind of fundamental normative issues, and they have to be tailored to your specific time and place, to the people that you're going to be working these out with. They're collaborative. They're collaborative endeavors. So, I mean, I think of philosophy as pretty much a collaborative endeavor. And the difference between public and academic philosophy is simply who you're collaborating with. Academic philosophy, it's a kind of, you're collaborating with a kind of other professionals, and you're kind of creating a whole kind of a world of philosophical issues and a conversation. Right. Public philosophy is simply just doing that, but doing it with your neighbors. Doing it with your the people you live on the block with, or the politicians who you have elected, in a sense, to steward your city, towards some particular goal. So, I do not think, because, the idea of non-universalist, because I do not think that there is some overarching sense of the way we ought to be, or the way we ought to act, or what's correct, or what's true. I do not think that one size fits all. So I think that it's the issues that I am engaged with, or I am, my point in time and space here has put me in contact with certain people, with certain concerns, certain issues. I have my children. I have to face I have to get them to maturity and the challenges I'm faced. That's where I want to apply that's what I want to use my philosophical skills and abilities, such as they are, for.
No, I understand that. I guess let me try and ask this another way. Look, it requires no explanation from an ordinary perspective. That you're interested and you care about what's going on in the place you actually live, right? I mean, that from an ordinary common sense perspective doesn't even need to be explained. In the philosophical framework, though, it does have to kind of be defended, right? Because, and this is why I was wondering if you would say something maybe about this idea of philosophy being parochial in some fundamental way. Because someone like a Peter Singer is going to say to you, well, if what you're concerned about is your ethical obligation, it has to be directed towards where there's the most need. And New York is not where there's the most need. The most need is where there's the most need is sub-Saharan Africa. And your parochialism is actually flat out unethical, right? Because you're prioritizing lower concerns from a standpoint of human suffering and human well-being, right? In other words, Singer for Singer, parochialism is sort of like speciesism, right? It's illegitimate, right? And I think that in a lot of ways, philosophy, at least its mainline tradition, rejects parochialism in a very fundamental way. And so I'm wondering if you have a more of a philosophical defense of what is your answer to a Singer who says, I understand you think the New York subway is very important, but there's pot-bellied children starving to death in sub-Saharan Africa. They matter more. And so you should be devoting your significant energies and monies to where there is the most need and not to the accidental fact of what happens to be right next to you. What's your response to that very common, and a Kantian will say something similar just along a different vector, right? Do you have a philosophical defense of this idea of parochialism?
Well,
did I just sucker punch you or something?
Yeah, I didn't get. No, well, it's okay. That's a serious challenge. I mean, I think that as I was saying before, I think that the norms that we live by are things which are stitched together, first and foremost, via human engagement and relationship. It's not a complete necessarily like an ethics of care, though I think that there's important elements to the ethics of care tradition that get at this. That your very identity, your very personality was established by the nurturing, say, of your parents, your formative years. You have been your very sense of your initial sense of what is appropriate and inappropriate, of what is to be expected and not, is established kind of on a very fundamental kind of emotional level, shaping your identity. And this continues in the various relationships that you have, your relationships with your wife, your daughter, friends, and it is important to kind of build this world, I think, from like yourself on out. Now, the idea about what has greater value or greater significance, or suffering, starving in the world, I mean, that is going to be an abstract. First, it's an abstract argument, based on kind of more certain principles.
Right.
But I think you have to get to those principles by this kind of much more kind of individualized, and then not just individualized, but relationship route. It's kind of like a hand in hand to get to the bigger picture. I am not in any way going to deny the suffering people have around the world. I think I am, at this point in my life, I'm in a better position to do more here. And I think that this is important. I'm uncomfortable with the thought that there is any sort of, and I guess I don't believe it, that there's any sort of kind of impersonal universal scale that can really say where the worst problems are and like what obligations that I have. If the point is that I'm obliged to give and work towards starvation in another part of the world, and if everyone else is, well, who is anyone here responsible for what's going on nearby? I mean, there's starvation here in this city which I live in. Kids are going to school in the public school system hungry. I think there's about 10% of the students in, when you think there's about 1 million public school students here in New York City, well over 100,000 of them are homeless, or are defined as homeless, either live in shelters or they live in temporary housing. They're getting bounced around from home to home. Many of them do not have enough to eat. There have been studies that have come out about, there's hunger. There's considerable hunger in the CUNY system. So on the collegiate level, there are kids not enough to eat. Is there a responsibility to them as well?
Yeah.
I feel that it's important to do things, to engage these sorts of issues and to try to work. I think working locally is not to be dismissed as illegitimate. I can't, but I don't think I can put it on a par, or try to balance it with kind of these more kind of a much more global perspective.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that if more people thought parochially, that some of the global problems would come down and diminished. So I don't think I'm going to be persuading Singer or anyone who would necessarily agree with him, but I guess I'm not persuaded either from the other perspective that I have a greater obligation to think globally rather than locally.
Yeah. No, listen, you don't have to convince me. I find Singer completely unconvincing. I guess the reason I'm asking is, partly just because I'm interested, as to whether sort of whether a critique of universalism and a predilection for a more parochial view of philosophy is in some way related to or falls out of your anti-realism, right? I mean, that's sort of one thing that
it does.
Maybe you could say just a word about how the relationship, because listen, we can have this discussion here. I've done very pretty high-end topics on this channel, and people are up to it. Could you say maybe a few words about how you see parochialism coming out of the moral anti-realism? Just give the advertisement for it, sort of.
Well, that if you take seriously, as I do, that your normative beliefs, your normative judgments are, that they are, they're not mind independent. They're not catching, or trying to hang on to an objective realm. There, it's a world to mind direction of fit. So then how what those beliefs and judgments are something that you have to work out, not just yourself, but I think with other people, with people the people you are naturally engaged with. So if there isn't kind of a universal truth, if there's no one way to how to live, for a human being to live, then there are a multiplicity of experiments in living. And the living, we often think about a million sense of, experiments in living. It's a hyper, individualized conception, kind of that, each one of us is supposed to try to find our own, make our own experiments, live our own way. But I actually think that it's crucial that this is something it's a communal thing. It's something that you have to do collaboratively. Many of our experiments in living, many of our kind of normative visions require other people.
I would say most of them. Most of them do, yeah.
Yeah. And so you need to engage the people that you happen to find yourself with, and work it out. So it's like they have their visions, and we have to kind of collaborate. We have to commiserate. We have to debate. We have to figure out how we're going to do these things here at this time. So that normativity is fragmented in that way. So all of these various experiments are tied to their time and their place. So that to me is like the anti-realism of, okay, so there isn't a right way here. Then what really matters is all the different ways. I'd like to see, 1,000 flowers bloom, in a sense, a different variety of ways of people living. So it is, rather than, okay, this is the way, and using philosophical reason have found, the truth, which I don't find that in any way persuasive.
Yeah, no, I like that very much. It actually, you were saying it's reminiscent of care ethics. I actually was thinking it's reminiscent of W.D. Ross, in The Right and the Good, who talks about these duties that arise, these prima facie duties that arise just simply out of the bare fact of our various relations to others. So, if you pay me a kindness, I feel a duty of gratitude, right? If I harm you in some way, I feel a duty of reparation. I mean, and that these are not articulable independently of those relationships. And the idea it sounds to me like what you're saying is like, look, if it was the case that moral obligations or duties were objective in the way that the mainline philosophical tradition likes to think they are, then they would be entirely rationally scrutable, right? But if they're not, then it means that we only can even know what they are in our engagements with other people, because they arise out of those engagements. And that's why Ross says what your actual duty is entirely local, right? It depends on what your prima facie duties are in the circumstances. Excuse me, and which are the most pressing in those circumstances, which means among the people you're engaged with. So I like that very much. I guess that then the last thing I want to ask you is, and I don't mean to ask you things that constantly are suggesting that you're Sisyphus pushing a ball up a mountain, but I guess maybe it does somewhat have that quality to it. And here's what I would say just about this. You're fighting two forces, right? One force is in philosophy itself. There's a tendency towards the universalism. You even said to me, one of the philosophers you approached told you he wasn't parochial, right? Isn't that one of the, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually where, the word, I've kind of co-opted the word. I mean, I was like thinking, let's look at some local issues, local problems. But I remember asking him, do you want to write something, about the cities? Like, well, my philosophy is, I don't really think very parochially, and it kind of like, I was disappointed, but I was like, that's a great,
right. I'm going to own the parochial.
Exactly. We need to make it, that's going to be the slogan, go parochial.
The other thing I'm wondering about has two pieces. And it's just reminding me of kind of a semi-fight I had with Massimo on Twitter just the other day about this. In the internet age, it's much, much less and less the case that people feel that their community is coextensive with their physical location, because that's number one. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you're fighting that, right? But number two, the city you're in is so cosmopolitan. In other words, I wonder if you'd be having a lot more success in a small town where there's much more of a sense of loyalty to place, right? Than in a place that is almost the definition of a global city, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether the parochialism, which I share, is just in your case, it puts you in a position where you're fighting so many forces. You're fighting the discipline, which tends to be universalist. You're fighting the internet age, which tends to sort of, community is where I find people that agree with me, even if they're not next door. And then you're also fighting the fact that cities are increasingly cosmopolitan and global, and there is no loyalty to place. There is no sense of, I don't know if that's very gloomy sounding or whether you want to go, but just that's what I'm wondering, whether you appreciate that these forces are going to have to be overcome to get any real traction.
Well, yes. I think they're all, they're different challenges. And
how do you get a cosmopolitan place like New York to start thinking more locally? How do you do that?
Well, one way is it has to think more locally in terms of, and it is. I mean, some of these trends are already happening. Has to think of it in terms ecologically, as we have to deal with issues of climate change. I mean, we're a coastal city, and we have the topography of the city, the harbors, the way that storms affect us, the way Superstorm Sandy affected New York City, any sort of storm like that. I mean, we have to deal with environmental issues and
that are specific to where
specific
you are.
To our city.
Right.
You think about the larger, like the watershed and issues about water. I mean, there are certain things that we do have to think about it in terms about so being a global city in terms of cultural reach, in terms of finance, in terms of politics. I mean, that is kind of a side point. We have local concerns and issues, but being cosmopolitan in those ways, being kind of this cultural mirror of the world in many ways. That's part of our local. That's who we are. I mean, that's the city. It's a unique city in that sense. I mean, we are a city where the number of languages being spoken is just extraordinary, and we are, a city with enormous immigrant populations. We are, we're a city that, in a sense, prides itself on this kind of a certain degree of openness, that that is part of our identity. So, as though, from living here, I mean, look, for many people living in the city, you identify with your neighborhood.
But do they still?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it used to be we would make jokes about this, and our professor would make. Brooklyn was a different country, right? One of our professors famously said, after being invited to a party in Brooklyn, he said, "I don't go anywhere where I need to get shots." Right? That was Jerry Katz who said that, I think.
Well, I doubt that there aren't too many places. Yeah, I mean, Brooklyn
I don't get the sense that New Yorkers still identify so much with local neighborhoods, local boroughs, even to the point to which it seems to me those regional local accents have kind of diminished, right? It used to be that a Bronxer, you really could tell the difference between a Bronxer and a Queenser and a Manhattanite. I'm just wondering whether has it sustained its kind of localness in people's minds?
I think it has. I mean, I do think that there is, kind of a lot of local pride and a lot of neighborhood investment, meaning, people being kind of active and concerned about what is going on in their neighborhoods, about their local schools, about, whether they have farmers markets and what's going on at the library. I mean, there's a lot of kind of Brooklyn pride, Queens pride. I live up, I live in Washington Heights, so I'm in the upper reaches of Manhattan. We call it upstate Manhattan, or it's way uptown.
Yeah.
And huge Dominican population in Washington Heights and in Inwood, and there's a fierce pride there about this is who they are. This is very much kind of their area that they have great emotional connection to, and for the non-Dominican population, it is kind of somewhat contagious.
You wind up absorbing it partly because of the local stores and the restaurants, and
yes.
You're going to get the cuisine. You're going to get the sort of the
Yes, and so Lin-Manuel Miranda, they're coming out with a movie version of the Broadway musical In the Heights, which takes place up here. So I mean, you've got there's a lot of, I think, a real kind of connection there to the neighborhood. And I think that you get this in a fair number of neighborhoods still in the city.
So that hasn't diminished.
Because I think it's something in a sense that you have to do in a city so large.
Yeah.
The city is just so incredibly immense that, I think it's almost very natural. You just like, okay, this is my little, this 10 blocks, this is our place.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that. And I probably nowadays just don't visit enough to sort of see that anymore. And don't spend enough time to see that anymore. I just got the sort of sense that what used to be a city that had much more local flavors has become kind of taken on this globalized quality where everything becomes kind of fusion-y, generic. So I can remember when the Upper East Side, 10 blocks was Hungarian, and then the next 10 blocks was Czech and German, and then actually the restaurants would change as you went. And now it just seems like everything is this sort of, nouvelle cuisine, artisanal stuff that could be anywhere. I mean, you could be in you could be in London, you could be in Paris. There's nothing. It's good to hear though from you. What sounds to me you're saying that hasn't really completely gotten washed away.
Well, it hasn't completely washed away, but the things you're concerned about are happening. That's true. I mean, it's there is a lot of local flavor is being lost. A lot of iconic places in different neighborhoods are closing down. Commercial rent laws are problematic here. It's just incredibly expensive. And there's also, there's a process of kind of like an odd suburbanization of the city is taking place. So it is becoming a more, in some ways, kind of comfortable place.
Yeah, I could see
and
that.
So you're getting, you're getting chain stores, and it is it's the city is changing. And things are being lost, but there is also certain elements people are still trying to hold on, but they're adapting.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, again, that is, kind of the philosophical challenge, or I think, humans adapt, to their change, but like, how are we doing it?
Right.
Is it a self-conscious, thoughtful, reflective attempt at adaptation?
Yeah. No, I guess, look, I mean, this is all grist for exactly the sort of philosophy you want people to do. And I guess maybe all that I'm wondering is whether in order to get people to do local philosophy, you may first have to really promote a more localist mentality, right? In a city that seems to be doing everything it can to become less local, right? In a certain way. And so it seems to me you really do have you got stuff to face that's not easy to overcome. You've got your work cut out for you, but I guess that's what makes it interesting and challenging, right?
Certainly.
All right. Well, thank you. This is really interesting and fun, and I hope we can maybe talk again, maybe about a single issue, a very specific issue. I wouldn't mind talking to you just in general about the stuff about ethics that we're talking about that are interesting. But thank you so much for talking with me about what you're doing. And
thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And I'm going to ask you to send me links to all the things you're involved in, because there's a links section that goes along with the dialogues that people can go to and see the things you're doing and maybe even get involved with. So thanks again, Joe.
Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it. It was
all right.
wonderful.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Ciao.